Hi everyone, I'm Professor Ross Tucker and welcome back to your guide to completing the Cape Town Marathon. I hope that the program is going well, that you're enjoying and successfully completing those sessions. Now, those sessions are obviously telling you what to do, when to do it, and how, in some instances, to do them. But what we haven't discussed is how you run, and that's the focus of today's video. Now, it might seem crazy to think about how you run, because surely running is something that we all just do naturally. And that is the case, but there are also some things you can change about the way you run that will improve comfort, potentially performance, and might even help you avoid injury. So it's quite important to think, at least in principle, about the running technique and maybe doing things that will unlock some free speed and keep you healthy. So this is a video about running technique, and the way we're going to do it is we're going to work from the ground, from the toes, all the way up to the nose. Now, the key principles are where your foot lands, where your hips are, how your shoulders and arms are positioned, and what your head does. So we're going to look at each of those in turn, and I don't want you to take away from this a whole lot of technical information that clutters your mind when you run. Running should be free and you should enjoy it, but just put these in the back of your mind as principles and explore them, feel them during your training sessions, and I'm confident that as you practice and as you improve the skill of running, you will become a better runner. So let's begin on the ground looking at the foot strike. The way that the foot strikes the ground has probably received twice as much attention as any other elements of running technique, particularly in the last 10 years, because first we had this barefoot running craze where people were literally throwing away their shoes in order to run barefoot, because that allowed you to run on the front part or the middle of your foot as opposed to landing on your heel, and that would reduce the forces and therefore prevent injuries. That was then replaced by a theory that you should run in cushioned shoes and not worry at all about how your foot landed. And there's so much information in this space that it can become quite confusing. So when we think about how the foot lands on the ground, there are broadly three what they call foot strike patterns. The first of those is a heel strike, which is self-evident. It's where the heel is the first part of the foot to land, and then you move over onto the front part of the foot. The second type of foot strike is a mid-foot strike, which again should be obvious. It's where you land more or less with a flat foot so that the heel and the front of the foot are landing together. And then the third, as we move forward, is a forefoot strike where you land on the ball of your foot. Now, there's been a lot of coaching advice, again motivated by the barefoot running craze and what it caused, and in theory some data, that will tell you that you should land on the front or the middle of the foot. The problem is that for most people, doing that means that they have to point their toe down. And when you point your toe down, it happens because your calf muscle contracts. And so what you'd be doing if you try to run a marathon on the front of your foot is landing 30,000 times with a contracted calf. And that is almost guaranteed to be a shortcut to injury. And so there's a real risk here that if you play around too much and you force the foot strike, you will actually cause the injury rather than prevent it. So if there's only one thing you take from this clip, it's that you should not worry about the foot strike. Despite everything you might read and everything you might see, how your foot lands is not what you should be thinking about when you run. Instead, the tip that I would give you is to focus only on landing as close to underneath your hips as you can. In other words, under your center of mass. If you land in front of your center of mass, then that causes a significant braking or jarring impact or force, and that's overstriding, which you don't want to do. And if you don't, therefore, bring your foot under your body, you become less efficient. So the best possible cue that I can give you, well, cues, because I'll give you two tips. Number one is apply the foot to the ground. Don't float towards the landing, rather activate your glutes and your hamstrings so that you actually bring your foot down, because that will prevent overstriding. And the second thing is that the best visual cue is that your shin bone should be vertical when you land. So a line from your knee to your ankle should be exactly perpendicular to the ground. If you achieve that as a consequence of activating your hamstrings and your glutes, then you'll be landing in the right place. Foot strike will take care of itself and you'll be as efficient as you possibly can be. So that's the most important thing. Not how you land on the foot, but rather where you land and how your shin bone looks. So let's move up now to the hips. And the reason we are interested in the hips for running technique is that the hips basically create the ideal running posture. And that's important because you have to be in the correct posture in order to maximize the efficiency and the effectiveness of your movements. When you look at most runners, especially when they start to get tired towards the back end of races or hard training sessions, what you will see is a posture that's not very effective for running. And that posture looks something like the hips going backwards and the upper body leaning forwards. That's kind of the crouched over, almost suffocated position that many runners will adopt when they get tired. Now, to address this, you need, number one, to be aware of what it should look like, and number two, quite a lot of strength in your core. And that's why we gave you those strength exercises. And you might recall, a lot of them involve planks and bridges and rotations that will improve that part of your strength profile. Because if you don't have that, you can't implement what we're about to demonstrate to you. Now, the first thing to think about is that when you are making the decision to either speed up or hold your speed, one of the things we tend to do is lean forward in the direction we want to go. But if I say to Beatrice to lean forward, what's the natural thing? Is this, right? You see, she's leaned at the shoulders. That's not a good position for running because what it does is it actually pushes the hips back. If you go back into standing and then lean forward, the hips go back as the shoulders come forward. And again, the hips is where all the action happens with respect to center of mass. So what you want is, instead of leaning here, is to lean from the ground. Imagine that there's a line from the ankles to the knees, to the hips, to the shoulders. That line must never be broken. Don't lean forward and make an angled line. It must remain straight. So you lean from the ground. That's the running posture, because if you now lean a little bit further and I release, that's the position from which you start to accelerate forward. So the key things to think about is lean from the ground, not the hips or the shoulders forward. Keep the hips forward and keep the hips high. If you can achieve those three things, you will be in the perfect running posture. Again, you can only achieve those three things if you are strong enough to keep the hips forward and high. And that's why you must not neglect the strength training exercises that we have provided you with. Again, high, forward hips, leaning from the ground. That is the perfect running posture. Next, as we move up, let's think about the arms. Now, you may have thought of the arms as these unheralded passengers that are just along for the ride as your legs do all the work. But in actual fact, the arms have quite an important function to perform. And that's to stabilize the rotation of the upper body that is caused by the movement of the legs as you run. So as your leg swings forward, it wants your body to rotate along with it, and that rotation is actually quite important. You don't want to lock it out, but it's the arms that provide the necessary balance so that you don't rotate too much and then become inefficient. Now, the faster you run, the more you need your arms. That's why, for instance, when you look at 100-meter sprinters, they need to have big, powerful arms because their legs are moving forward with massive speed and force. You don't need that because you're running a marathon pace, not a Usain Bolt 100-meter race. And so you don't need anything like that same movement, but you do need the arms to do certain things well in order to be maximally efficient. And those things are how you carry your arm at the elbow, and then how you allow your arms to move with the rotation of the upper body. So let's look at both of those things quickly. So from the side, the most important principle we'll demonstrate is what's called the arm carry, and that refers to how bent your elbow is. Now, a lot of runners will make one of two mistakes. They'll either run with the arm too straight, which is inefficient because now that lever is too long, so mildly uncomfortable. But some people tend to make this error. The more common mistake is that they will hug themselves, and that becomes a little bit suffocating. So they run almost with the elbow too bent, and then you almost close off your chest and your upper body, and that doesn't allow sufficient freedom of rotation. So what you want to aim for is an elbow that's roughly 90 degrees, so a nice right angle, which you can see here. Some people will want to go a little bit lower than that. Other people might want to come a little bit higher, but that's more or less your reference point to start from. The next thing to think about is how the arm moves. Now, this should be as natural as possible because remember, your arms are basically there to counterbalance what your legs do. That means a couple things. One is, the faster you go, the more arm range of motion you're going to get. Whereas when you're running a marathon, you're going to get much smaller movements. don't force the arm movement to be larger or faster than it needs to be for the legs. The second thing is the position that the arm moves in. Think about putting your thumb on the waistband of your shorts at your hip and then moving it towards your clavicle or collarbone. That's really the compact movement that we would be looking for in running. And again, it largely depends on speed because that drives bigger range of motion, but that's the kind of movement you're looking for. Again, the most common mistake is to bend the elbows too much and then you suffocate yourself. So what we want is nice right angle position, thumb to shorts, thumb to collarbone. And this is obviously an exaggerated motion for effect. There's also a rotational component, which we'll look at in a moment from the front, because the arms don't move simply backwards and forwards, they also rotate as the upper body does. But that's the key thing to think about with respect to carries, a relaxed elbow and a small compact movement as much as necessary to balance the legs. Let's look at it from the front now. You've seen the nice arm carry from the side, and from the side, it looks very much like everything moves in a straight line, like a train running along a train track. In reality, running doesn't look that way from the front. And why not? Because there's a considerable amount of rotation. Every time a leg swings through, it brings the hip forward with it. And so we rotate at our hips. And it's important that you don't lock that out because it limits your stride length. So you actually want some rotation at the hips. And what that rotation does is it changes this back and forward movement into a rotational movement of the arms. So again, you're still moving your thumb from your shorts, the top of your shorts at your hip towards your clavicle, but with the addition of rotation, you'll see now that your hands move towards a midline. So we talk about a midline that runs from your sternum down to your belly button, and the hands will come quite close to that midline if you're using a proper arm carry. There's a temptation here to overdo the rotation, and what happens then is that the hand crosses the midline. So Beatrice can exaggerate that movement. That's too much rotation. It'll actually throw you off balance in the other direction. So what you want in a good arm carry is what you've seen from the side, allied to a little bit of rotation at the hips, nice 90-degree elbow, and the arms, or the hands rather, coming close to the midline as a result of that rotation. That's the perfect arm carry. Right, so we finish at the top of the head, but also including the neck and shoulders, because what we most want to avoid when we think about the head and the neck is the tension that you often find develops when you are fatigued and when you're getting to the back end of a harder training session and, for instance, the marathon. And what that then looks like is a runner who hunches up. They bunch the shoulders, it tends to pull the head down, and this is not a good position to be in for running because it closes off the airways. You're now looking down at your very next step instead of looking forward, and effectively you're narrowing and suffocating yourself. So the key word, the first key word anyway, with respect to the head is up. Get the chin up, get the eyes up, and one of the best cues to think about is look at a spot about 4 or 5 meters in front of you on the road. That's where you want to look because that puts your head in the best possible position. This can cause the tension because now you're working harder on your neck, and that's something you just have to practice. It's a conscious decision to make your shoulders relaxed when you run. We spoke earlier about the arms and how they're carried. That can transmit a little bit of tension into the shoulder, as can the head. And so you just have to practice that. That's something you build into the last 5 minutes of every run that you do, is a deliberate attempt or focus on relaxation in the neck and shoulders. Now the second cue with respect to the head is forward. So the two are up and forward. And when we talk about forward, we're talking about where the head fits on that line that we spoke about earlier. Remember we said that there's a straight line from the ankles to the knees, to the hips, to the shoulders. Well, that line continues up and the head needs to be part of it. So when you think about that lean that we spoke about earlier, the head is actually an important component of your lean. If you lean, again, from the ankles, keeping that line forward, and there's a little bit of pressure on my hand here, if you now pull the head forward, you will be in a position to fall. The head contributes significantly to your forward movement. And this is something you practice on hills. When you go uphill, there's a tendency to scrunch down and look down. Focus on getting up and forward. And when you go downhill, if you put your head even slightly forward, and it'll feel a little bit strange to you, but Practice that on a downhill and you will feel that you are being propelled down by gravity. And that's how you learn the feeling of where your head needs to be. So, up, forward, and remember to relax.